faithfully sharing value and interpreting great books from around the world. Hello, this is Sally with Book Talk. Today we're interpreting a book titled I Also Have a Dream. In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr., a leader of the American Civil Rights Movement, delivered a famous speech called I Have a Dream in Washington, D.C. No, we're covering this book that borrows the speech title because it tackles America's race issues. Why did a nation founded on all men are created equal keep slavery at the start? How did the North-South divide on race issues come about? As a disadvantaged group, how did African Americans gradually win equal rights? The author of this book is Lin Da, a pen name for a Chinese American couple. Lin Da has published a series called Close Look at America, specializing in introducing America's political and judicial systems. So in I Also Have a Dream, they specifically add a legal perspective to examine how America's racial issues evolved. After finishing this book, you'll find that despite America having wars over race historically, and even some bloody events in modern times, but the resolution of this issue has mostly happened within the legal system as a long-term, gradual, and lawful struggle. For over 200 years, people have pushed legal progress through compromises. That's why the idea of racial equality has finally gained recognition across society. Next, I'll break down this book for you in two parts. In part one, we'll discuss how America's race problems started and why the North and South formed a standoff. In part two, we'll cover classic cases from the 1960s civil rights movement, showing how disadvantaged groups used legal means to fight for their rights. First, let's dive into part one. How did America's race problems come about? Why did the North and South form a standoff? Looking at history, America's race issues almost formed alongside the nation's founding. In the early 17th century, when the first British immigrants landed on North America's east coast, the continent was largely wild, with harsh living conditions. And for these new immigrants to survive, the key was having enough labor to help them cultivate the land. So, facing the harsh wilderness, European humanitarian principles were quickly forgotten by these new immigrants. They engaged in trade with South American slave traders, exchanging timber for large numbers of enslaved Africans to exploit labor. And so it began in North America. Thus, by the time the United States was officially founded in the late 18th century, the slave trade had already existed in North America for over 100 years. By this time, many leaders of the American Revolutionary War had developed a strong sense of human rights. Jefferson and Washington both passionately advocated for the abolition of slavery. Therefore, around America's founding, several northern states where the federal government was based gradually passed laws abolishing slavery. However, two southern states, Georgia and South Carolina, were unwilling to follow this historical trend. This was because these states were developed much later compared to the northern states. Moreover, the quality of immigrants was much lower, and until America's founding, these states were still very poor, lacking conditions for a modern market. So, if forced to abandon slavery immediately, their economy would risk collapse. Thus, during the drafting of the Constitution at America's founding, the 11 northern-leaning states compromised with the two southern states, Georgia and South Carolina, allowing them a grace period to gradually abolish slavery. However, later on, more southern regions joined the United States, expanding the territory to 25 states. Among these newly joined states, some had even more primitive economic conditions than Georgia and South Carolina, making them even more dependent on slavery. For example, Mississippi and Alabama were like this. Therefore, these southern states also implemented policies to delay the abolition of slavery. Thus, from the late 18th century to the mid-19th century, America had two sets of systems regarding race issues. But during this period, The American South appeared much more backward than the North, both in ideology and institutions. And this disparity became the fundamental cause of the American Civil War in the 1860s. When we talk about the American Civil War, most of us know it as a civil war. The two sides were the federal government, which advocated abolishing slavery, and the Southern state governments, which insisted on maintaining it. But many people may not realize that, the most direct cause of this Civil War wasn't the issue of whether to keep or abolish slavery, but whether the Southern states should stay or leave. As we mentioned earlier, by the time the U.S. was officially founded in the late 18th century, the Northern states had largely abolished slavery, and ordinary Northerners increasingly embraced the idea that all men are created equal. This American spirit grew more widely accepted, while slavery was universally despised. However, due to economic reasons, the Southern states couldn't achieve abolition until the mid-19th century. Under these circumstances, anti-slavery forces in the North grew increasingly stronger. They increasingly exerted pressure on Southern governments through various activities, urging them to abolish slavery as soon as possible. As this pressure built up, it made Southern state governments consider simply seceding from the U.S. and starting fresh. Entering the 1860s, this idea finally turned into actual action. The direct cause that spurred this transformation was Lincoln's election as U.S. president. Because Lincoln consistently and firmly advocated for abolition, his election made Southern states feel American slavery was finally ending. Thus, the Southern states resolved to leave the U.S. together and establish a new nation, allowing slavery. As a result, in February 1861, Southern states elected a new president and fully declared independence. So, under the historical conditions, did the Southern states actually have the right to leave the U.S.? Theoretically, yes, because according to America's founding agreements, the states were in a relatively loose confederation. So, yeah, but when such a departure became imminent, any president would feel unbearable pressure, fearing they'd be seen as a historical villain for allowing the nation to split. Lincoln was no exception. Therefore, after a painful struggle, he decided to preserve the nation's integrity despite congressional opposition, resolving to end secession swiftly with force. But what he didn't anticipate was that the war lasted a full 4 years, with nearly 600,000 young lives lost, and the entire South nearly reduced to ashes. Faced with increasingly devastating losses, Lincoln grew clearer that merely opposing secession wasn't enough to sustain the legitimacy of the federal army's invasion of the South. So, when the war was about halfway through, Lincoln issued the famous Emancipation Proclamation. He shifted the war's objectives. He changed the war's core focus from opposing national division and preserving the Union to abolishing slavery and freeing enslaved people. This instantly placed him and the federal army he led on the moral and legal high ground. After the Civil War ended, the U.S. Congress quickly passed the 13th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution. At the constitutional level, slavery was completely abolished and black citizenship was established. Thus, slavery in the American South came to an absolute end. Yet the end of slavery didn't mean the end of inequality. The South experienced over a century of racial segregation after the Civil War. So how did Black people legally fight for equal rights with whites and other ethnic groups? In part 2, we'll explore this specifically. Objectively speaking, after the Civil War, while slavery was abolished in the American South, Southern society's attitude toward Black people and all people of color actually regressed. Many poor white Southerners, having witnessed their homes destroyed and loved ones killed, had their anger toward Northerners intensify greatly, and their pre-existing discrimination against Black people further turned into hatred. They even frequently organized to intimidate and abuse Black people. After abolition, Southern U.S. states immediately enacted strict racial segregation policies. Most notably, all public facilities in the South were strictly segregated by skin color. Schools were divided into white and black. Churches were divided into white and black. Restaurants were divided into white and black. Even restrooms were segregated by race. At that time, Southern states enacted such segregation policies by exploiting a constitutional loophole. Because the Declaration of Independence contained a phrase called separate and equal, originally describing America's desire to separate from British rule to gain equal international status. But during abolition, racists deliberately twisted this to mean different races should remain separate, claiming only this state was equal. Superficially, this separate but equal arrangement might seem fair. But in reality, after gaining freedom, Black people struggled to integrate into society and find jobs, enduring prolonged poverty. Naturally, Black facilities quickly became poorly maintained, overcrowded, and dilapidated. So this superficial fairness masked deep, actual inequality. Even so, Southern Black people now had freedom, granting them more opportunities than under slavery, and their awareness of rights and dignity gradually awakened. By the 1950s, a middle class emerged among Southern Black people, including highly educated civil rights leaders. For example, Martin Luther King Jr., as mentioned earlier, was a key representative. Today, King's greatest legacy is steering the Southern Black civil rights movement toward unity, rationality, and nonviolence, establishing a legal and rational foundation for America's civil rights struggle. For instance, buses in Montgomery, Alabama's capital, had white-only and black-only sections. Black people couldn't sit in white seats. From 1955 to 1956, led by King, 55,000 Black Montgomery residents launched a 381-day bus boycott in protest. During this boycott, Black people united, supported each other, and voiced demands rationally, causing minimal disruption to social order. Ultimately, the U.S. federal court ruled racial segregation in Alabama's public transit unconstitutional and ordered its abolition. The day after the ruling, King declared the boycott successful, and America's Black civil rights movement entered an unstoppable peak. This phase produced landmark cases profoundly impacting civil rights, the movement, and America's entire judicial system. Through them, you'll see implementing new laws involves far more than just announcing and enforcing them. Even in a highly legalistic nation like America, without genuine public support, enforcing laws remains immensely challenging. But these legal cases drove continuous reflection and discussion, ultimately making racial equality a societal consensus. Here, I'll share two of the most representative cases with you. The first case concerns Black people's right to equal education. Equal educational access means equal racial development opportunities. Thus, educational equity is the most crucial aspect of racial equality. As early as 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court received 4 cases from Southern states, all filed by Black parents. They wanted to enroll their children in all white elementary and secondary schools, but were rejected. Through these cases, the Supreme Court ruled that racial education policies in Southern states not only denied Black children better resources, but more importantly, caused psychological inferiority, fundamentally violating the constitutional principle that all men are created equal. So, in 1955, the court explicitly ordered Southern public schools to end segregation and implement integration with all deliberate speed. But the all deliberate speed requirement created loopholes for some. Most Southern schools gradually complied, but Mississippi and Alabama in the Deep South used deliberate as an excuse for delay, refusing to integrate. In these states, due to civilizational gaps and politicians deliberately stirring public sentiment, enforcing this ruling proved tumultuous. First, in Mississippi, in May 1961, a Black student named Meredith formally applied to the University of Mississippi. Meredith met all the school's admission requirements, yet the school explicitly stated he was ineligible due to his skin color. After learning of this, the NAACP immediately provided Meredith a lawyer to sue the university for violating the Supreme Court's integration ruling. After a full year of litigation, Meredith won in June 1962. Federal courts issued an injunction ordering the University of Mississippi to enroll him. By that September, the U.S. Supreme Court, embodying the spirit of the Constitution, also clearly supported this ruling. In this situation, Mississippi Governor Bennett immediately gave a televised speech declaring that he and his state officials would rather go to jail than enforce such an order. Suddenly, the situation in the South became complex and critical. As we mentioned earlier, after the Civil War, Southern society harbored deep-seated hostility toward the North. Governor Bennett publicly motivated the federal government's order because he knew very well that his actions, in the eyes of Southern grassroots people, it was a heroic act against centralized rule, and it would build useful political capital for his future elections. On September 20th, 1962, Black student Meredith announced through his lawyer that he would head to the school to complete registration. Once the news broke, Governor Bennett immediately dispatched a large number of police to blockade the school, and Lieutenant Governor Johnson, under Bennett's direction, arrived at the school entrance to block Meredith and his group from entering. For a time, campus police, state police, federal agents, and reporters from around the world crowded the University of Mississippi campus, making the scene extremely tense. At this crisis point, Meredith's side remained very rational. They continued filing lawsuits in federal court, striving to resolve the issue within the legal framework. In response, the Federal Circuit Court quickly ruled that the school and governor were in contempt of court for obstructing justice. The next day, under the pressure of the ruling, the school and governor conceded. Meredith finally entered the campus, completed registration, marking a historic moment. Regrettably, the entire incident had inflamed extreme racist sentiments among Mississippi's grassroots. After news spread that Meredith had completed registration, about 2,000 white grassroots people stormed the campus, attacking campus police, reporters, and federal agents, escalating the conflict into a riot. 2 innocent people unfortunately lost their lives. At this point, we can see that the conflict involved 2 sides, the northern camp representing the American spirit and the extreme southern camp representing conservative forces. This fundamental conflict made it super tough to push Supreme Court rulings and laws through Southern society, practically crawling through molasses. And if politicians with shady motives get involved, it can easily spark bloody clashes. But by the mid-20th century, oh boy, Southern society's ideas about law and national unity had improved a ton since the Civil War ended. Overall, even if Southern folks didn't agree with the laws, they kind of got used to them. They built up the habit of sticking to legal procedures and respecting Supreme Court decisions. Less than a year after the bloodshed at the University of Mississippi, Alabama, another hardcore Southern state, saw its governor step in to block Black students at the state university entrance, like some kind of drama show. But this time, it was way more about putting on a show than real fighting, and the whole thing ended peacefully. The 2 Black students smoothly finished enrollment. This time, the Southern grassroots didn't riot. They gathered at the University of Alabama gate, shouting protests, but didn't go all radical in the end. Even though they didn't like decisions from the federal government and Supreme Court, they learned to keep it cool and end things properly, which shows society's rule of law mindset. was getting stronger. So that wraps up the first case in the 1960s Black civil rights movement, where legal fights led to wins. All right, next up, we're diving into the second case, how a landmark civil rights law got set in stone in U.S. history on the evening of June 12th, 1963. Yup, the same night that Alabama University standoff ended peacefully, President Kennedy gave a major TV speech. In his speech, Kennedy used the Alabama University mess to announce he'd send a new civil rights bill he'd been cooking up to Congress for review. This was a real solid effort because it aimed to fix Southern Black rights issues through the law. And in a country like America, that's all about contract spirit. Only by making laws to give Blacks the exact same rights as whites can we truly fix the inequality. But to pull that off, the civil rights movement couldn't get too wild. Sometimes they had to make compromises. Otherwise, it'd be tough to win sympathy for the law in Congress, since most lawmakers were still white. If they faced full-blown hostility from Black people, they'd naturally develop a self-protective mindset, reluctant to grant them more opportunities. But this perspective wasn't understood by most Black leaders then, especially Northerners who hadn't experienced segregation yet, were more radical, even using violent rhetoric like New York's Malcolm X, proclaiming all white people are devils. So, though the new civil rights bill reached Congress, its passage seemed light years away. In this climate, Southern Black leader Martin Luther King Jr.'s unwavering nonviolent resistance principle proved incredibly valuable. On August 23, 1963, with President Kennedy's backing, a massive peaceful rally gathered at the National Mall in Washington, D.C., drawing over 200,000 people. At this rally, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his legendary speech, "I have a dream," expressing the beautiful vision of a harmonious world. But just 3 months later, in November 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated. After Kennedy's death, successor President Johnson repeatedly urged Congress to pass the Civil Rights Bill swiftly to fulfill Kennedy's final wish. President Johnson, hailing from the South, spoke with a thick Southern accent. Americans who lived through that era later recalled nothing was more stirring than hearing a Southern accent edified president passionately champion civil rights. Congress members originally opposing the bill changed their stance under Johnson's relentless advocacy. In summer 1964, the new Civil Rights Act finally passed Congress, marking the first federal law banning racial discrimination across all public life domains in U.S. history. From then on, people of color legally held equal rights to white Americans, and a new era of racial integration finally dawned. But as you'd expect, this new era's arrival didn't instantly dissolve Southern society's deep-seated resentment. Moreover, any new law wanting to truly take effect needs to undergo the test and refinement of practice, and the Civil Rights Act is no exception. As we mentioned earlier, after the Civil War, the South actually regressed significantly in rationality, especially in some extreme regions where the original concept of rule of law was destroyed, the psychological barrier to violence was breached, and many people even became accustomed to expressing dissatisfaction with the federal government through violence. Therefore, after the new Civil Rights Act was passed, several Southern states with the most severe racial discrimination began to resist the publicity and promotion of the Civil Rights Act through terrorist actions. And among these terrorist actions, the most extreme were two incidents. One was the case of killing Northern college students in Mississippi, and the other was the case of killing a Black officer in Georgia. Let's first look at the first case, which occurred in June 1964. Two white college students and one Black college student from the North volunteered to come to a small town in Mississippi to educate the Black community about the content of the Civil Rights Act. But unfortunately, they were quickly targeted by local extreme racists. That afternoon, around 4 o'clock, a police officer in the town stopped the car of these three students and took them to the police station for alleged speeding. Around 10 o'clock that night, after requiring them to pay a $20 bail fee, the police officer released them. They drove away from the police station and then mysteriously disappeared. The disappearance of these three students quickly drew attention from northern civil rights organizations. The civil rights organizations reported to the FBI, and the FBI immediately dispatched an investigation team to the town to investigate. But everyone in the town, including the police officer who arrested them, unanimously claimed that they had left. However, FBI agents discovered the car of these three students in a dense forest near the town. The car had been completely burned, leaving only a shell. After that, there was a 44-day-long investigation. During these 44 days, federal agents interviewed thousands of residents in the town and even the entire county, but found not a single clue. The FBI then mobilized a large number of personnel and equipment to explore the wastelands, jungles, swamps, and rivers of the entire county, but still found nothing. Well, in desperation, FBI Director Hoover himself approved a $30,000 reward for anyone providing leads, with a strict promise to keep informants' identities confidential. For 1960s small-town Americans, 30 grand was a huge fortune. Finally, the plan worked. Someone secretly contacted federal agents, revealing the truth. The three students were dead, buried beneath a dam deep in the local swamp. The FBI had to use heavy excavators to dig up the three bodies from the dam's base. They'd been shot. And before dying, they'd suffered brutal beatings. And when the news broke, the nation was shocked, and the killers were exposed. Investigations showed they were KKK members, the Klan being a white supremacist extremist group. More shockingly, the arresting officer was KKK too and had joined the murder. Case closed, but actually bringing the criminals to justice, that proved way harder. See, under America's legal system, criminal cases must be tried locally, with juries deciding guilt. Problem was, this murder happened in a deeply racist town where most whites were extreme racists. Prosecutors convincing that jury to convict, like smashing eggs against rocks. Even worse, Mississippi's Justice Department demanded the informant be handed over as hard evidence for murder charges. But given the times, the FBI couldn't trust Mississippi's officials. They feared the informant would face instant retaliation. So Mississippi's DOJ used this to refuse prosecuting the 19 suspects for murder. Meanwhile, our second case, Georgia KKK members killing a black officer, had also happened. And in this case, the victim was just a black officer passing through a Georgia village on official duty. And so they were mercilessly intercepted and shot dead. Since the case facts were clear, it did get prosecuted for murder in Georgia. That the local jury deliberated just 3 hours and ignored evidence to forcefully declare defendants not guilty. These two cases represent arguably the darkest moments in American judicial history. They exposed a fundamental flaw in American democracy, that so-called democratic systems, without sufficient humanitarian spirit, become tyranny of the majority over minorities. Fortunately, these cases weren't entirely bleak. What gave them a turning point was precisely the newly passed 1964 Civil Rights Act. While murder trials stayed with states, civil rights violations could now reach federal courts. And supported by this new law, justice was ultimately served. Across both cases, 21 defendants were convicted of civil rights violations. 4 got maximum 10-year sentences. Looking back today, we might feel indignant that such brutality got only 10 years. But under America's historical context, this sentencing was progress. Most importantly, this progress, while maybe unsatisfying, was achieved through rational, gradual means. And after the verdict, both Northerners and Southerners acknowledged its validity. This step became a solid foundation. To this day, racial issues persist in America, but public understanding has surpassed civil rights era levels, with most issues resolved within rational legal frameworks. After the Civil Rights Act, America gradually introduced affirmative action policies. Broadly, these not only ban discrimination by dominant groups, but require them to share benefits with marginalized communities. For example, public universities prioritizing people of color in admissions, governments and companies hiring minority quotas. Honestly, the implementation of these provisions shows how America's humanitarian spirit, pursued since its founding, after spreading for over 2 centuries, has gradually taken root across society and borne fruit. Lately, affirmative action faces growing debate as historically marginalized groups gain strength, with many calling to phase out special accommodations. Some states now vote on repealing certain policies, yet, regardless of outcomes, affirmative action's historical impact and embodiment of American ideals remain an underlying force for progress. All right, that wraps up I Also Have a Dream. Find show notes below. See you tomorrow.